for me, it transforms how I work every day.
The reality is the best solutions are the solutions that work for the people who need them.
Ultimately, APIs are contracts. And in any large software system, I think contracts are paramount.
But Jens, I know you had a thought there. Feel free to add to it.
You kind of destroyed it, but Robert, I'm curious.
What did I destroy?
My day. No.
And we're live. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for another episode of The Good Thing. Today, we have a very special guest, someone we've been working very closely with, but Robert Farr, a principal architect at Procore. And as always, I'm joined by Jens, my co-founder and co-host. Robert, how are you doing today?
Doing great. It's a beautiful morning, so a little overcast, but it's bright out. So enjoying the day.
Fantastic. And where are you calling off from? Is it? You've told me before, but I'm curious to hear again.
Yeah, we're I'm out of north of Kansas City, Missouri, so right in the central United States. So
Awesome. And I don't know if you know this, but I used to go there often last year, or no, 3 years ago before we started WunderGraph, because I worked for a company called Milo, which was literally like on the line of Kansas City and Missouri. So you can go back and forth between the two, which kind of threw me off a little bit because you would see the different license plates, but it was a good place to be. I loved it.
yeah. No, it's an interesting city. I mean, we're right on the border between two states. There's state line drive that's probably right in the range of where you were. So
Exactly.
a lot of culture.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today. So today, what we're going to be talking about is just kind of your role and experience. So first, your role at Procore, things you're leading, overview of your experience, and then we're going to dive a little bit into the kind of the conversations that we've been having, things that you've seen in your years of experience, for example, with delivery pipelines, GraphQL Federation, AI, how AI is coming into organizations and things like that. It'll just be like an ad hoc discussion like this, but to kind of kick things off, Robert, tell us a little bit about your experience. So we've been working with you as you've been at Procore, but where did your journey begin?
Yeah. So I've my Procore journey has been the last I would say 3.5 years. But prior to that, I spent really got my start at one company. So 22 years at a enterprise healthcare IT company. That company is now part or is Oracle Health. So for
Oh,
those that are curious, but I started out there as a software engineer, right, junior software engineer, and got to experience building an enterprise company that ultimately became an enterprise SaaS company over those years. So learned a lot from a lot of very knowledgeable architects over those years, and got to see how you can transform an industry with software. In this case, it was very healthcare focused. And now I find myself kind of doing the same thing in the construction industry.
very cool. And this company, what was it called before it became Oracle Health?
It was called Cerner, Cerner. So Cerner
Wait, I had it.
Corporation. Yep.
They just recently became Oracle Health, right?
Yeah, in the past couple of years, I believe. Yeah.
So I had a lot of friends that worked at Cerner, and then they went to Milo, which is where I was at, because Cerner has a good headquarters out where you're based, right?
Yeah. Cerner headquarters was here in Kansas City. It was founded in Kansas City back in 1979. So I had the privilege of getting to work for the founding CEO or the founders for the majority of that time. And it's really, I would say a lot of my colleagues and coworkers, they have spread out into a number of different startups and companies in this area. Some of those are working remote, but some are really right here in Kansas City.
Kansas City has a decent tech hub. From what I remember when I was there, there's some decent startups and just kind of established companies. I worked at Lockton, but Cerner's there. Does Procore have an
Yeah.
office there or no?
We have a WeWork. So Procore, shortly after I joined, we acquired a company called LaborChart, which had a office in Overland Park. So there is a number of Procore uh, employees and engineers that live here in the Kansas City area.
That's awesome.
Um,
And go ahead.
oh no, yeah, you said in terms of a tech hub. Yeah, I think Kansas City is it's got a really interesting tech hub. There's the Kauffman Institute downtown that really helps startups get going. So it's fostering a lot of innovation.
No, I can attest to that. I've seen it when I visited. It was awesome. And then you started off your career at Cerner, and you said you spent 20 years there, or how did you make the jump to Procore?
Yeah. So funny enough, so towards the end of, the last thing I was working on at Cerner, we had built a SaaS, cloud-based SaaS offering, multi-tenant. And when I first got there, often when you go really fast, right, you hit that initial thing, and then you start to scale, right, and scale brings new challenges when you're adding customers very rapidly. And so I deviated from kind of distributed systems and distributed databases for a while, and helped bring in kind of the site reliability engineering practice in that space. And two of my main leads, a week apart in 2020, told me, "Hey, we're gonna go work for this exciting new company." And neither knew that either or, and they both went to the same place. It was Procore, so that caught my attention.
Yeah.
And it was about a year later that I finally saw a position, and decided to take a deeper look.
And was this pre-IPO that you joined or post?
I joined post, they joined pre, so we were right on that, both sides of that boundary.
Okay. And if you could, for the audience, just tell a little bit about what Procore does, because most people don't know this, but a building that you've probably been in used software to help build it with Procore. And Procore was a very fast-growing startup. I read a little bit about the CEO and the journey that he took it, but tell the audience a little bit about what Procore does and the software and just what you've helped build with them.
Yeah, yeah. So Procore really, historically is really focused on the general contractor. So project management, quality and safety has kind of been the bread and butter. And so really any large, schools, hospitals, buildings, right, um, roads and bridges, right, all of these large construction projects, almost all of them use Procore in some sense to help manage those projects, manage all the details, all the workers, and we're continuing to then build and expand upon that, doing more and more what we call workforce management, field work solutions. So when you get to the construction site, you see software on site, helping those in construction get the job done, and you'll see Procore present there.
It's amazing.
Um,
And go ahead.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so like when I did the research on Procore, the founder, he was a contractor, right? And then he kind of saw a
Yeah,
gap in the market that there was no tool to help with this.
yeah, yeah. TUI, TUI, and this is what's for me was interesting, right? Because when you see founder-led startups, there's a lot of passion that goes with that. And that TUI saw a problem in the construction industry, um, and took that opportunity to say, let's go build something different. What's interesting, and this is my theory on enterprise SaaS, is it actually takes a long time, a lot longer than you think. So Procore had been around 15 to 19 years, I think, before it IPO'd. Um,
I think you're right,
and
yeah.
yeah, and some of that is, you're trying to serve an industry that is not yet quite caught up to technology adoption. Healthcare was very similar. I would say it led construction. Now you kind of see the construction industry really embracing technology. Um, and I think Tui said at one time, he said he was trying to decide, if it was construction or agriculture. So maybe someday agriculture would be that next big wave of kind of technology innovation in the enterprise side.
No, that's a
So
great point. Jens, do you have any questions or points to add to that? I read a lot about Tui's journey. I know that he started off as a contractor. He didn't have a tech background, right? He was just a general contractor and he saw a problem.
no, yeah, yeah, he was, Tui, as I understand, he was the guy that came in and he framed everything up, right? Like that was his trade. Um, but he, like you said, he saw that it was hard on those in construction, right? Like it's for those who work construction, they know how hard it can be. Many times it's long hours, it's aggressive timelines. and there's communications paramount, right? Like the ability to share information accurately is paramount when you're trying to coordinate, so many different companies and so many different individuals on a large and complex project.
You know what's exciting is I don't know if you're hearing it, but we're gonna dive into like your experience and what you're building at Procore. But what you just said with construction, like timelines, communications, you guys are more or less doing the same thing now, but just in the software space. You're not building hospitals, you're building the software that helps power those hospitals. So communication is important, the deadlines are important. The grit, you're not lugging around things, but still there's a lot of stuff that you have to do with that. And so this is a good segue into like your role at Procore. So you're a principal architect. What does that entail? Like, what are you tasked with architecting? Is it the entire Procore platform? What are you kind of specifically focusing on?
Yeah, so I mean, my primary focus at Procore is really, I would say, trying to help us become a construction platform, right, or a platform for construction on which to build. Um, and so that takes me into a number of areas, right? It takes me into kind of our infrastructure, right? How do we think about scaling and building and managing our customers' data? It also takes me into how we build services, especially with all of the changes. So I'm always trying to stay just a little bit ahead of the curve or enough ahead of the curve that I can help guide us to where things are evolving. And we'll talk about AI more here in a bit, but it's probably the biggest shift in software engineering or in a lot of the industries at this point, at least in my career of 20 25 plus years. Um, but so I spent a lot of time there, and then with the last part of that is really, what are some of those core services, the core entities, information architecture that makes us up, and those pieces come together to really say, here are we a platform company. Here's how we allow it to be extended. Here's how we allow our customers to leverage and then build upon it.
No, well said.
I
And
have a question.
sometimes, oh, go ahead, Jens.
In a company like Procore, what role do APIs play, and does the company high level think about APIs? Like what, like if you ask the non-technical people in leadership, how do they know APIs? Do they think about APIs? Just how do different stakeholders inside an organization like Procore think about APIs?
It's a great question, by the way,
Yeah,
Jens.
it's a great question. I I'm going to say really depends, and that's where, when you look at how the software was built, how it's evolved over the years. We do have a very healthy marketplace and API ecosystem. So you can go to developers.procore.com. You can see that. Um, so there is a component of Procore that's very interested in API contracts, making sure that we can, enable partner integrations and enable our customers where they need to be. Um, and then there's the other side where I think, you know, where more of the focus is on the application itself, right? So whether that's building a particular web-based workflow or a mobile application where the APIs, a lot of times I feel like are secondary concern, right? They become a need based on trying to satisfy what you're trying to build or provide from the application experience. Um, so it's kind of depends, right? It depends on where I guess the perspective or context that somebody's in, how much they worry about APIs. Um, I would say, those that, like when we look at our developer ecosystem, it's much more concerning. I as a software architect, I generalize it more into maybe, I mean APIs, but ultimately APIs are contracts. Um, and in any large software system, I think contracts are paramount. That is where you get yourself into trouble really quickly as you scale. And it's not a new idea, right? Like it's loose coupling, high cohesion, right? Like these are concepts that have been around for a long, long time, but they're hard to adhere to at scale, especially when you're going fast. And but ultimately, it's when you have tight coupling and lose cohesion, right, you really start to have the what we say tech debt or maintenance burden that kicks in as a result.
That's well
Yeah.
said.
It sounds like you would not say Procore is an API first company.
Um, I I would say no, not yet. Um, and just because that's where I think historically it's been more solution first and then ecosystem second.
When you say not yet, do you think it should?
Well, I think every company should, uh, and that's because of what the change. Like I would say what AI is doing, right, to how we build software, what software we build. I think it's going to reinforce that need for solid API contracts. And so you're going to have to, um, the first consumer, right, that we start thinking about in the future is probably an agent, right, an AI agent, rather than an external developer, rather than an internal developer trying to build either a mobile or a web application. Um, that's kind of the opposite of what it is today, right? Like, or at least it has been. Where I think first we think about our internal developers, and then you think about your external developers, and this is not uncommon, I would say, in many companies. And some get it, some do it the other way, right? Like it's baked into the DNA of the company. Sometimes that starts from the top down. Um, but you'll see one of those two orientations, and I think that's going to pivot.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Before we dive deeper into the ecosystem of AI, like I'm for me, the foundation of AI is APIs. AI
Mm.
or LLMs without data is just a cool model that
Useless.
Yeah,
can come up with whatever token you ask it to come up, but yeah, how much can it do? One great example, for example, is if you go to ChatGPT, deep research.
hmm
I think deep research is a prime example for how the future looks like. And if you can have something like deep research and you can give it MCP access to all of Procore APIs, even if that's just internal, it doesn't even have to be public. That can be just for people inside Procore. This can be a crazy, interesting use case because it would allow someone like a business person to ask a very complex question, and then
yeah,
a deep research model can go on a journey of working for 10 minutes, crunching data from various sources and creating a report. And then this business person, they just end the coffee break, and now the report is ready and fresh. And I think that is where the industry is heading. But before we go deeper into AI, one thing I'm curious about is, so we can talk a little bit about your API stack, the API stack you're building currently. You're
hmm
building something with WunderGraph, with Cosmo, which brings us here. But I would also love to hear your journey. How do you think about APIs, and how has your opinion of APIs changed over the years? Like how did you end up with the mindset where you are today, and how did it change over the last couple of years?
yeah, that's a good question. Um, I would say, um, I've had several experiences with monolithic databases, both at Cerner and at Procore. And so, for me, it started at what you see is it's very easy for your table schema, right, in a monolithic scenario, to become the API, right, to become the contract. And So that really impressed upon me early the need for proper, API encapsulation, because otherwise it's very hard to evolve, right? Like one trade-off you make when you define contracts or you define APIs is you sign up for, passivity and, thinking about the impact of API change on your customers or the customers of those APIs. And so there's a higher level of responsibility there, right? You just can't change it or break it willy-nilly, so to speak. Your internal details, right? You have a lot of flexibility to refactor that, to evolve it, um, much more so, right, than your external API contracts. So that really kind of, I would say, just set up a kind of rule system in my mind of like, okay, let's make sure these are important. They warrant the extra time to try to make sure you're going to do them right or do them well. They're never all right. That's something I've learned over the years. Um, so that kind of frames that. I think other things, we've seen, um, uh, just the advent of REST, right, and REST APIs. And what's interesting, I watched that evolution, and there's this tension, right? I would say when you're trying to define contracts, you're trying to define certain patterns or styles, even in REST. Hate OS, very few things actually adhere to it well, right, or perfectly. And that's because pragmatism comes in, but also it's hard, right? It's hard to consistently, approach some of those standards in a way that then also is it useful to the consumer, right? What's the impact on the consumer of those APIs? And so that's the other friction I think I've really um, comes to mind, right? As I think about contracts, I'm thinking about like how do we deal with that kind of governance problem or the consistency problem at scale. When you start, it's not like there's one engineer, right, or one person that goes and defines the API for everything. And you see this in other industries, anywhere where, like, in healthcare, there's HL7 standards body, and there's an immense amount of hours and people that are involved in making those standards, and it takes a long time to change them, right? There's a lot of discussion that goes into it. um, and then it's not necessarily the easiest thing to go adhere to consistently. And even in healthcare, we always found that just because there was HL7, you would still find differences between providers of that API, whether that was Cerner or Epic or one of our other kind of competing healthcare solutions. The same API, they wouldn't quite behave the same.
So well said.
Yeah.
I see you thinking, Jens.
He's thinking.
What's the follow-up
I'm
question there?
I'm processing.
Yeah.
I need to split the tokens, but what do you think is the best API style?
The best API style. Well, maybe I don't. What do you mean by style? Are you thinking just in terms of like approach
Like
to how you define them,
RPC
or
style, hypermedia
RPC or REST?
style,
Okay, I gotcha.
RESTful query
Um,
style?
yeah. So to be honest, I find RPC to be probably the simplest, most straightforward. But it also has, right, challenges of bloat and maintenance at times. I think that was something that REST style APIs tried to simplify, right? The hope was you have resources with a few operations and a lot of things you could do on the other end. So that's kind of two ends of the spectrum, the way I think about it. But I find, like, as a consumer, RPC is a lot easier to reason about, right? Take this action. I understand what here's a response that tells me what it did. And if you think about, what kind of changes, right? What kind of changes do we make to state? Your basic CRUD operations, they're there, but they're really changing information. But the moment that you start getting into what I'll say are the kind of the logical changes of state, statuses, and you know, um, maybe evolving something from published, or from draft to published. Um, that's where RPC really kicks in, right? And REST, it starts to get kind of funky, or you'll see people kind of move away from REST, and they'll add these, my resource slash publish, right? Which is not a RESTful API, at least in terms of HTTP, but becomes more RPC like um, over time. I'm usually in a uh, uh, think about the consumer of the API, right? And so sometimes it's right, like the basic REST stuff is exactly what they need, and sometimes you need more of that RPC style of API, because at the end of the day, it's your consumer that kind of drives the contract you really should be providing. Um, if you're not satisfying, kind of what they need, then you're just creating friction, right? You're creating friction for them. You're creating adoption friction if you're trying to, create more value with the service you're building. Um, and so you've got to be pragmatic. Um, so I guess at the end of the day, I'll say I'll favor whatever works, but I probably think RPC is a little simpler.
What about you,
Yeah.
Jens? What's your favorite API style?
So if we go through all of them, I personally think hypermedia is the smartest style ever invented, which nobody really understands. So when I heard the first time about agents and how they or LLMs, how they could use APIs, for me it was immediately clear hypermedia was built for agents. And do you know how many people use hypermedia for agents? Exactly nobody, because I think nobody ever understood the power of hypermedia, because you go to the landing page of a thing and it returns a hypermedia answer with
Mhm.
hypertext that tells you this is a shopping cart. Here are things in the shopping cart. If you want to go to the checkout, send a post request to the checkout. This is so
Yeah,
much smarter than MCP. Are we doing it? No, because I think most people don't understand the intentions of the web, and so I fully agree with you in the sense that, and this is how my thinking has evolved over the years. In the beginning, I was driven by excellence. I was driven by perfection, and I thought the best solutions are the ones that are perfect from a technical point of view. And what I have learned is the reality is the best solutions are the solutions that work for the people who need them. And what you're
yeah,
saying, I think I would add one thing. You said RPC. I agree. RPC is great, and I would add webhooks, because if you have an integration with something like GitHub, and then something happens, you need to be notified about that, and you want to have notifications that are not tied to an open connection, or something that are super simple to implement. And nothing is easier to implement than a webhook. So I think RPC and webhooks are great. And then another opinion I have, and happy to see if you disagree or have another opinion. But
hmm
one thing I have observed is a lot of companies try to use internally try to use gRPC and REST, and I think it's not working well. And I know I'm biased, but I think internally everybody should have a graph, because the for me the big advantage of having a graph is you're not tying a resource to one service. Because I think the absolute worst thing you can do is you can say we have this core entity in our construction whatever, and it has 50 fields, and they all must be implemented by one service, and that's just not gonna fly, because what you will run into is you will have, you know, in a domain model, you always have like certain entities that somehow they are correlated to everything, like a user object or something. And then everybody comes to this user service and says, guys, we need to integrate with your user service. It needs to give us certain things. And then suddenly user service, 50 fields, 100 fields, whatever. And every time someone wants to somehow evolve the API, they have to add something to the service. And this is where Federation would simply allow you to say, you can add 3 fields and you put them into another service, and that means you're freeing up this one team to that owns this. But on the surface, I think, so internally a graph, and then to the outside some sort of webhook system, and I think to the outside there should be an easy way to create SDKs, because that's another opinion for me that has evolved. When I was like a few years ago and I was observing how everything unfolds, I saw that somehow REST APIs are winning. And I was wondering, is it like, are REST APIs really that good? And kind of what crystallized for me is, nobody wants REST APIs because they are also, they typically lead to situations of very tough conversations, because it's not entirely clear how you should structure a URL. Do you put the version in the URL, in the header, in whatever? And then you can have so many debates around whether you should design something like this or that. Super simple, straightforward solution, just RPC, JSON over HTTP, and then some sort of RPC contract. Wrap it up with SDKs and make it simple for people to download an SDK and have like a type safe integration. Which also, I think, in the age of AI, if I want to integrate with Procore, give me an SDK, give me documentation how the SDK works, and I can tell Cursor to wipe code whatever we need, because it can just call these functions and it's clear what they return. And I think, for those reasons. So my opinion, internally, you should have a graph. You should have, to the outside, you should have a webhook system, JSON, RPC, SDKs. What's your take?
Yeah. So I might be a little bit more nuanced, and I would actually argue that most companies want a graph. Now, I'll be very, very careful here to say I'm going to separate GraphQL from graph. Think of graph in terms of the data, and this is one of the reasons why I think about our information architecture at Procore so much. Fundamentally, you want to understand all the connections of the data, be able to navigate through them. So you want a graph. And if you think about hypermedia, one of the intents of hypermedia was, I always thought about hypermedia as a way to expose that graph to a consumer, right? Because you hit a URL, but then you also get linkages to all of these other things from that point. So hypermedia was a way to expose a graph, and exposing a graph can be difficult. So and again, it requires your consumer to really need it, or gain advantage of it. So what I know, we went down the hypermedia route at Cerner for a while, and what we found is it was a lot of work, and there wasn't really, for the squeeze, the juice wasn't that good in terms of our consumers using it. So fast forward, when I start looking at like the evolution of backends, right? So we moved from monoliths to, we swung the pendulum towards microservices, everything. We created new problems, right? Because now, I always say there's a federation layer somewhere, right? There's a layer within your software stack where you're trying to pull things together into a unified single thing, right? Sometimes that's your public API surface. microservices moved that out of the database, right? Effectively, and they moved it into this hypermedia layer. And what I've seen done in the past is, one approach to that is you have an internal API surface. A lot of times that's gRPC, or maybe it's HTTP, and then you have an external API surface, and behind that external API is some stateless piece of software that's then making other API calls on your behalf, and it's all handwritten, right, hand constructed. And that's one way to try to create that separation. GraphQL Federation, I think, builds that in, which is one of the really intriguing things about it. But it's been interesting, right? Like, as you look at the industry, and I've said if GraphQL and GraphQL Federation were there the day that REST came about, then it probably wins, right? Because there was a pivot point in the industry there. The REST was there, and so they kind of took the day. And so now, what I've seen with GraphQL specifically, kind of with hypermedia, is this challenge of who are the consumers, right? And again, today, or up to this point, our consumers have been developers, right? Web developers, internal or external developers. And so now you're these changes, right? The changing those patterns. One thing has kind of won, but now we AI enters the picture, right? And this is, for me, this is the game changer, because it you have an opportunity, right, to now say, well, what's the best API that I can provide to an agent? Kind of like, so there, now we're kind of back to like, well, hey, wait, GraphQL Federation or hypermedia, something that's going to allow me to express the graph, the underlying data graph that we have, to that LLM. And then now we can start to pull something together that's really useful for customers of that functionality. So I think that's, we're in this window right now of I would say exploration with AI, right? We're not, I wouldn't say we're to the point of where we're really exploiting it yet. But it is a disrupting factor in terms of, now there's a new consumer, right? And so there's an opportunity to say, is there a better way for us to expose our APIs than handwritten REST individual resources, or just kind of a pragmatic approach there? Can we create a more structured way to provide information? So things like GraphQL schema was built in day one, right? It's schema first approach. I always said REST and HTTP were kind of schema last, right? So documenting your API, awesome, the contracts, OAS, all those things kind of came after the fact rather than up front. And there's a lot of power in having that schema, because it provides metadata and information, i.e. the say the metadata, right, necessary for something to understand what it is and then how to leverage it. So that for me is kind of that's going to create a pivot point in the industry. It'll be interesting to see where it lands here over time.
Well said. There's a lot of interesting points there. Yeah, do you want to dive deeper into those before we segment into the next one?
One thing I want to say about Federation is, and that is something, it took me a long while to really see that and understand the value in it. If you think about the graph as a whole, and like you said, everybody somehow has a graph of data. The question is, how is it represented? And if you have a federated graph and you take a query, what we have built is, we have built a serverless query planner, so that for every query, we can show you how the query plan looks like, and we can analyze all your query plans. So we can build complexity scores for all query plans. We can figure out how many fetches are they making. And we can, from that, we can create kind of like a Gaussian function where we see the distribution of query complexities. And this is something where I think things get extremely interesting at scale, because if you look at the distribution of query complexities of a large organization, you can understand the data access patterns, and you can evolve the graph in a way, and you can move ownership of fields like from one subgraph to another to better satisfy the majority of your queries. So to better align the graph for its actual usage. Because day one, everybody's in a good mood. You start with 3 subgraphs or whatever, and you think you have cut them in the right pieces, and then your API consumers come in on day 3, and they are like, okay, this is the way we want to access data, and then you realize maybe you have like a majority of consumers. They have a query complexity of 10. And then you have a few consumers, they have a complexity of 30. And you're wondering what is going on. Why are they behaving differently? What is our graph not designed for that? And for me, this was an eye-opening. So we had this idea of let's just build it. We didn't know where this is going. We were just curious about, okay, how would it look like? And I think the interesting observation we made is, if you don't have such a graph, if you have REST APIs, if you have gRPC, if you have just any API landscape, you will never be able to understand. And this is something where I think there's the power of declarative. Because if something is declarative, like a graph, and you have a query and you have a compiler in the middle, the compiler can give you statistics, and it can tell you how are we constructing a query. And I think this is really the superpower of having a graph versus REST APIs.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's interesting. I always say, right, like new ideas are old ideas. So if you really peel the layers back, right, think about what relational databases did for the industry when they came around, right? Moving from flat files to now this relational model. But if you think about a database, right, you have schema, you have a query, right, syntax, you have a query planner, you have data storage, and in my career, especially as I entered distributed systems and all those kind of things, right, you move to key value stores. What really I was seeing happening is we were pulling apart this relational data store that we had lived on forever, and broke it up into constituent pieces. And the real missing piece has been that query planner, right? The syntax and the query planner piece. If you think about REST, right, that's absence. It's all over the place. So it'd be like exposing a database, the raw blocks and indexes, and say, go make it, right? Go get your data. And I see GraphQL Federation as that layer. Yeah. So sorry.
Sorry for interrupting, but you made up a great point. A REST API is a little bit like you can access raw pages.
Right.
And it is your responsibility to do something meaningful with that, versus a supergraph where you have the different subgraphs and you have the query planner. And I like what you said with databases, and I think these kind of observations, you can see that you have a few more years of experience compared to me. But one thing I remember, when I first learned about how to use MySQL, I was introduced to the explain keyword. So you can write a query like select star from user, but you can also say explain select star whatever, and then you do join whatever, and then the query planner, it will actually show what kind of indices is it using to join another table, how is it accessing this and that. And in the what is funny about this, I haven't thought so much about it, but if you this explain statement, how is it joining? Is it using an index? This is exactly what you see in a query plan from a federation router, because
Yeah.
the query plan will show you what kind of keys are we using to jump from one subgraph to another subgraph. So
Yeah.
you could say federation is kind of like an evolution where we went from key value stores to relational databases to like resource based microservices to like a graph based microservice architecture, where we can now with a query planner understand how we're accessing data.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's kind of, I guess, a database for the web, right? and if uh, if you wanted to tongue in cheek it, but it is literally. I think it's that one, right? It's that one layer now where you pull it all together and you have that ability to create those kind of that insight and those optimizations. Giving part of your stack now can make decisions on the most efficient path to get the data. And that just since the advent of REST and microservices and all that, that's just been absent into the industry, because once you pull a relational database apart, right? You pull that apart into multiple microservice and independent databases, you lose a lot of the value that monolithic relational database was giving you. Or even if you used a graph database, same kind of thing, right? If you have a monolithic graph database, well, there's a lot of value you get from being able to navigate using its query language, navigating the graph. But if you pull that apart into 100 graph databases, you lose a lot of that. And I mean, I look at kind of GraphQL Federation as the potential to put that back together.
Yeah,
It's well said.
I,
One just note from my end. I liked what you said about that with the like kind of just going in the past. One thing I've always heard is like it's never a bad idea, it's just a bad time. And what you said
Mhm.
previously, like if you peel back the onions of or the layers of the onion, it's history again, and history tends to repeat itself, which is really, really, really funny. But Jens, I know you had a thought there. Feel free to add to it.
Yeah.
you kind of destroyed it, but Robert, I'm
Destroyed it.
curious.
What did I destroy?
My day. No, Robert, I'm curious. How do you see the connection between federation and AI?
Yeah.
Good topic.
So yeah, it's a good topic. Right. AI is this thing that is, I would say, just, yeah, I mean, for me, it transforms how I work every day. It's just like every tool I use and the new tools I'm using, everything's driven by AI. Um, and we're, internally, right, we're trying to sit there and say, like, how do we embrace AI? How do we, create an AI first platform? Um, so I think that's really, I think you mentioned this earlier, Jens, that, you know, AI and LLM, right? I would say there's really four pieces for me right now, and we're evolving, so this will change. But you have to have scope, right? So this is often what we call an agent profile. Tell me what your
Mhm.
purpose is, right? What's the bounding scope? You're trying to get that LLM to focus a little bit. Um, and the second piece is then there's I'd say rules, right? I'll say guidelines or rules. So this again, you're trying to provide the LLM, maybe a decision tree, right? Like help guide it when other things are going on. Then I'll talk about the graph, which is really the data, right? Like it's current state, context, insights, all of those things together, along with the ability to make change. And then there's a knowledge base behind that, right? And the knowledge base that typically comes from our industry knowledge, our data platform, right? We do all kind of processing and training on the LLMs to make them smarter. Um,
Yeah.
and But if you don't have those four components, right? Our experiences with that today, right? Hallucination happens, right? It'll overachieve, or it'll try to overachieve and then go off kind of off the rails, and you don't really achieve what I'll call a valuable result. And I always say it's key, right? Customer value is paramount, and so you always have to keep that in mind with those interactions. So in that, right, we're working on the first two, right, defining agents, right, defining the rules and guidelines and all that stuff. And we're building. Many companies have built knowledge bases already to train them. That missing piece is how do you make that graph accessible, right? How do you provide it in such a way that you allow the AEM LLM to get current state context, right? What's actually going on here? What
Yes.
insights do we have to pull from to then frame its kind of decision matrix and the outcome, and then ultimately the action it might try to take, depending on the type of agent you're trying to build. That I think is the key piece. And so that's where, if you think about a developer, right? I can go off on a whole theory about what I've seen in the industry in terms of like software languages and libraries and all those things, but we have been catering to human developers for years, right? For decades even. And so it's been this constant race to create, easier to build with APIs, right? ORMs come along instead of SQL. Um, you know, uh, REST really favors, I would say, a human developer more, but just because of the simplicity, or RPCs, same way. Um, but now we have this agent, right? And it's really good at, if you give it a good schema, a good contract, and good metadata, at navigating those things. An agent almost does better with SQL, right, than it does an arbitrary set of APIs that aren't well connected, right, where you don't really get a sense of the graph. And so that's where I see GraphQL being kind of that potential sweet spot of saying it's almost like SQL for the web, right? If you think about GraphQL, you get to express a query, a detailed query of what you want, and obviously the graph kind of navigates you through things, but it provides that powerful access to all of that data for an LLM that allows it to navigate it. That's where I see maybe I don't know, I'll say a pivot point of how do we power those LLMs with that insight and quickly.
There's a lot to
Yeah.
unpack there. Yeah, go ahead.
I think one important point is, and it's often discussed, context window with LLMs. There's a limit, and I think GraphQL it aligns perfectly with allowing an LLM or a developer to clearly articulate how much data do I want to expose, and how can I limit that. If you just I keep seeing the question, do we need MCP? I could just use OpenAPI, and then there's tools that eat your OpenAPI spec and immediately turn it into an MCP server. The problem I see with this approach is it's very imprecise. I think you need to give an LLM very precise instructions, what it can do with a tool, how it can use it, and then you want to think carefully about what kind of data do you expose and in which format, how much data you want to expose. That's one thing. And then another thing that I think enterprises should carefully think about is, should we now build specific MCP servers that talk to our internal infrastructure, essentially becoming another layer of BFFs, which we just tried to get rid of with Federation? Or should we take a step back and think about, okay, is now the right time to build a super graph, a data graph, a federated graph, however you want to call it, unify the APIs behind that graph, bring authentication and authorization into this graph layer, and then have something on top. And I think this is where the ultimate power comes for an organization is, if you build this graph once, on top of the graph, you can build SDKs, you can have JSON RPC for humans, you can have You can have MCP for the LLMs. And if you want to build rich web applications, you can have a relay client talking directly, or an Oracle client or Apollo client, talk directly to the GraphQL endpoint. So I think ultimately, this super graph layer, I think it becomes the backbone for like a digital enterprise. How do you see it?
Yeah, it's like, I agree. I think that's one of my big worries, right? So I think I've been on record internally saying like MCP is the future of APIs, right? Because more of our API, as we think about APIs, we're going to target the agent first, right? Like how do we build APIs that an agent can leverage and then create value from? But to that end, that's one of my big concerns is like, okay, yeah, here's another, right, layer in the stack that people have to then craft an MCP API for every microservice or all that. The value I see in the GraphQL Federation, because a lot of the things that we might get away with for human developers, right, you can't really get away with for an LLM. If you give an LLM raw schema, it does a pretty good job. But if you give it well-documented schema, right, it can do a much better job. Um, so I would say it's going to pivot us to thinking about APIs as schema first and then implementation, rather than implementation and then you kind of generate your OAS spec after the fact. That's I think one of the key powerful things. And then, having that one layer where now I can sit there and go say, okay, well, here are, one of the things I'm playing with right now is, locally I'll turn it on, right? I just say, hey, turn on the MCP server, explore the entire schema, execute anything you think you need to execute, right? And so then I start down the path of trying to mimic an agent I'm trying to build, right? And I want to see what it's going to try to query, the kind of queries it's going to try to run. And then ultimately I can capture those queries and bake them in and say, okay, here's a first class operation I want to expose. So then when we deploy it, these are the specific operations I'm exposing via MCP. And it becomes a very easy kind of back and forth experience. And that's not something, right? That's not something that you can do with REST. I mean, I can give it a set of REST APIs and it'll call them, but then to package that up, right, into a very simple query that I then say, here, serve that as MCP endpoint. I don't have another tool like that. So I see that that's where we start making, I would say, the effort, right, the squeeze, so to speak, of defining schemas up front, documenting them well, working through, um, implementing certain patterns or enforcing certain standards at scale across an entire enterprise, right? Building a single kind of super graph, that all becomes worth it because now you're able to easily expose those capabilities to the LLM.
This is super interesting because, well, what you're saying is you provide an approach how to develop an agent against a graph. So if I can reiterate,
Yeah.
you run the router locally, you switch on the MCP gateway, you allow on the MCP gateway, you allow to run arbitrary queries, and then you instruct a model, for example, using cursor, I guess, you instruct a model to perform a certain task. And then you observe what kind of operations will it do to accomplish the task. Maybe we can even build a feature around that and help you capture that in like a session or something. And then you can say, oh, okay, here's what the LLM tried to accomplish. Here's the queries it made. And we can now package up these queries as an MCP tool. And then in production, the model will not have it much easier because now it doesn't have to explore the schema. You can precisely describe each tool and how it can help achieve the task. But also from a security perspective, in production, you might not want to expose the whole graph because it can it can be confused by a response or something, then it calls the wrong tool or something. So I think that's very interesting. And Stefan, this is something we should definitely look into, how we can leverage our MCP tooling in dev mode to help someone develop an agent. It's interesting.
Yeah. We are a little bit almost at time, but I do want to ask two questions actually. Well, one, your customers are typically, like contractors and people building things. What is their take? Because what we've heard from the past from you is, you guys are very customer focused, listen to the customer voice, you're building for
Mhm.
these people that are using your product. What is their take on AI? Are they going to be late adopters to it, or are you guys adopting AI to make yourselves more efficient for them? But how are they taking this AI boom?
I think it probably depends. So we have a range of customers, right? From very large enterprises down to, small, mom and pop shops. Um, so, depending on the customer, right? Like their approach there. I think, at one end, our customers are asking us, "Hey, what's your plan? Right? What are you doing?" And so they are, they're kind of going through the same thing we're going through, right? As all the tools they use to do their job now, like AI is coming to bear. It's changing the way I record meetings, take notes, provide
Yeah.
communication summaries, right? All those things are changing, and they're looking at us in the same way, right? We're just one of the tools they use to do their job, and how is AI going to drive um, better efficiencies in their workflows? Um, so we get a lot of that. I think as you get to the smaller ones, they're looking for just their understanding of AI might really be just through the lens of the application experience they have, right? So it's more of, was it intuitive? I kind of say, like, there are your smaller customers are, you go to Google search, right? And you type something, and every once in a while Gemini shows you the AI summary. That's probably a delighter in their world if we get that right. Where we're kind of adding into their workflow. But where your bigger, more sophisticated enterprise customers who are also API consumers, maybe want to author their own agents, right, or leverage their own LLMs against our software stack. They're very interested in what we're doing there.
No, well said. And then my last question is, um, you guys are pretty, I would say, tech forward. For being a public company, you guys are very like on the edge. You're adopting new technologies, things like that. With your opinion, where do you see this AI boom going with Procore? So we talked a little bit about the AI agents, the things like that, but what kind of tooling have you guys adopted to stay on that cutting edge?
Uh, well, it's I'd say Procore's very forward thinking there. I mean, we're kind of all in. So we're looking at AI from every aspect. So all of our internal tooling, we're looking at how AI is going to make us better. So whether that's Atlassian or Jira or GitHub or you name it. Um, but we're also then looking at how we're going to be, how do we apply AI to the solutions that we build. So it's kind of two-sided, but it's a top-down strategy at Procore. That it is, we're going to be I'll say an AI first company. You'll see a lot of that in Procore's publications if you go out there today. Um, but we're trying to take advantage, and there's a it's interesting because this is I said earlier, like, this is the biggest shift I've seen in my career in the software industry, right? Like, um this is huge. It's changing the game for so many things, right? And it's going to have so many impacts on so many areas, not just of how we do software development, but also like how we use tools, how we get our jobs done every day. And I think there's a window here where companies are either, you kind of got to dive all in, and we're in the exploration phase, so it's going to be interesting while you're in that exploration phase. But if you don't, we're going to come out of this, and if you're a late adopter, now you find yourself kind of behind, right? Really
Yeah.
behind. And so I think, for me, companies need to be embracing this, and it's changed, right? Everything's changing really fast. There's security concerns, there's all those things that go with it. But it's kind of a race right now, into figuring out how to, as we explore, figuring out how we can get to the point of really exploiting the value of it, creating better, more customer value. Ultimately, that leads to better business value. Those are going to be the things that are going to drive companies, and you'll see the companies that do it. I think they'll come out in a much better positions, and I think companies that are going to be maybe a little conservative or risk averse might find themselves in a really bad position in a few years.
Well said. And what a great, quote to kind of end the podcast. Well, Robert, thank
Yeah,
you so much for joining us today on The Good Thing. We really appreciate the conversation. We love what we're building together. And the way we usually end this episode is I just go to Jens and I say, hey, Jens, what's the good thing?
We're back next week.
Awesome. Thanks again,
excellent.
Robert, for the time.
All right. Yeah, thanks for letting me join. Enjoyed it.